Thank you, Thomas. What Ayn Rand taught the Dark Ages. I have what St. Benedict taught the Dark Ages, his and ours, with a subtitle, a Lenten meditation. At least a little bit of a Lenten meditation. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, we read that the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to those who did receive him and believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And so it's in the wilderness that the most profound theme of Lent is struck. And for the monastic culture of the Middle Ages, the notion of a dark age was not an historical notion. It was drawn from Christian anthropology and Christology. And the story is summarized in the first chapter of John and the fourth chapter of Luke. Adam and his progeny were cast from paradise into a desert, into what Augustine would call the region of dissimilitude, where the race of men were caught in the brambles of sin, not knowing the light, and therefore not truly understanding themselves. And so the new Adam, before he begins his public ministry, goes into the desert in search of the old Adam, praying and fasting, being tempted by the devil for 40 days, according to Luke 4. The incarnate Word showed the light in the way back to the house of the Father. It's a standard monastic theme over the centuries. St. Benedict was not the first Christian who went into the desert to discover this light, but he's justly renowned for molding a very simple but sturdy institution for those who are in search of it. And in this sense, perhaps Benedict is a patron saint of Lent. So, what he taught the Dark Ages, his and ours. My presentation consists of 4 little compositions along the line of nocturnes on the evening theme. In biology, of course, a nocturne is a plant that flowers in the dark. Nocturnes, indeed, were the night offices said in a monastery, a sort of spiritual analog to a nocturnal plant. Thank you, Ursula. In modern times, a nocturne is a musical composition evoking a nighttime theme. So my 4 nocturnes, Owl of Minerva, Dark Age, Curriculum, and Hearkening. And I'll start with the first one, Owl of Minerva. And it gives me great pleasure, speaking of what Benedict taught the Dark Ages in a Lenten meditation, to quote Hegel. His most quoted 3 sentences. One more word about giving instruction as to what the world ought to be. Philosophy, in any case, always comes on the scene too late to give it. When philosophy paints its gloomy picture, then a form of life has grown old. It cannot be rejuvenated by the philosopher, but only understood. Only when the dusk starts to fall does the owl of Minerva spread its wings and fly. Hegel's aphorism has been interpreted in various ways. Probably he meant to say that life rather than philosophy is prescriptive. The philosopher can grasp the whole of a thing only when it's complete, in the face of which there's no point in legislating what ought to be. Perhaps he also meant that when civilization approaches its demise, then the owl of wisdom can take stock of its essential genius, but too late to do anything about it. Only at the end of a civilization do its true geniuses appear like a swan that sings one last song. Hence, the owl of Minerva takes flight not at the morning star or in the noonday sun, but at dusk. From the monastic perspective, this Minervian moment is marked at the 7th liturgical office of the day, which Benedict calls Vespers. The word Vesper is taken from Greek mythology. Vespers is the personification of the evening star, the planet Venus, in its evening appearance. The Vespera, then, are prayers at the time of shadows. Measured from the first light of morning tide, the Vespers fall sometime between the 10th and the 12th hours, 4 to 6 p.m., depending on the season. In chapter 41 of the Rule, Benedict prescribes that these prayers must be chanted before the need of artificial light. This time is distinguished from the very end of the day, which is marked by the office of compline, which from the verb complere, which means to complete. Compline is chanted maybe at 8:30, and with it the hours of the day are finished, and monks, in hope of the resurrection, submit themselves to the great silence, to a darkness that swallows all of human knowledge, like the tomb that awaits all of us. Wisdom, therefore, must come not at the end of the day, but in the shadows, sort of as Hegel suggested, in dusk. Just when things are complete enough for us to take their measure and to consider what the world ought to be, but not so complete that wisdom itself slips into the oblivion of darkness. Traditionally, in the monastic culture, the Vespers represent a time of judgment. The hours of the day, the individual soul, of the people, the whole race of man. No less an authority than St. Augustine himself speculated that after Adam and Eve sinned and hid from God, he came to find and judge them at the hour of Vespers. Why at this time? God can judge the defendant while there's still light. Not physical light, of course, but the light of conscience, which was already partially in eclipse by the shadows of sin. In the monasteries under the rule of Benedict, 4 consecutive psalms are usually chanted at Vespers. Psalm 109, he judges among the nations, making their ruin complete. Psalm 110, he has shown his people the power of his works. Psalm 111, blessed is the man who fears the Lord, he shall shine as a light in darkness. And Psalm 112, from the rising of the sun to its going down, let the name of the Lord be praised. Then the monks proceed to chant a very ancient hymn entitled Lucis Creator, with its verse, Creator of light who joins morning in the shadows and for our instruction calls it a day. So, wisdom depends on our ability to know a day and how to take its measure. Thus, the monks were enjoined at the end to pray, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. But let's return for a moment to Hegel's more historical image of wisdom arising phoenix-like just as a civilization reaches its demise. The Catholic Church of late antiquity provides us with 2 Minervian figures of this sort, St. Augustine and St. Benedict. Augustine was born in 354, the son of a minor provincial official in a town in North Africa. He was formed in the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And though Augustine complained bitterly about the intellectual shallowness and moral turpitude of his education, anyone who picks up his works can't help but be bedazzled by what he learned in that trivium. For elegance of style, power of speculative intellect, Augustine was, I dare say, the greatest thinker ever produced by Roman culture. When he died in 430, his city was surrounded by Vandals, and in retrospect, I think we're entitled to think this was the Vespers of the ancient world. For his part, Benedict was born in 480, 50 years after Augustine's death. He too came from a small Roman provincial town, Nursia, today Norcia, in the mountains of Umbria. A town going back some 1,200 years at that time. It was the borderland of Etruscan and Samnite tribes. His father was a minor Roman official, and as an adolescent, Benedict was sent along with his nanny to Rome to learn the very same trivium as studied by Augustine. First, he needed to become a grammaticus. And what was grammar? Knowledge of words. And according to ancient wisdom, everything which does not deserve to pass into oblivion and has been entrusted to writing belongs necessarily to the province of grammar. Like Augustine, Benedict absorbs himself in grammar, but very quickly worried that rhetoric, the third part of the trivium, was morally corruptive. For his part, Augustine did not pray for an emancipation from rhetoric until he was in his mid-30s, Indeed, Book 9 of the Confessions, he describes his baptism as a liberation from rhetoric. But Benedict renounced rhetoric at the age of 16 or 17. So far as we know, Benedict only studied the first part of the Trivium, but he never renounced grammar. Indeed, the rule of Benedict requires that all of the brothers learn to read in order to appropriate the external written word of Scripture and the external liturgical word in choir. And thus, Benedict sort of represents the via media between this very loquacious Augustine, who regretted his training, and the hermit monk St. Anthony, who, the greatest of all monks, remained illiterate altogether in order to only attend to the internal word that manifests itself in the desert. And in any case, abandoning his formal education, Benedict tried to live a monastic life as a hermit in caves in the vicinity of Subiaco, not far from Rome. And like the great desert father, Benedict learned experimentally. He became so proficient in knowledge of the divine word that other monks asked him to be their master. Now, in the rule, Benedict says, it may be the most important comment made in the entire rule, he intends to found a school, a scola, for the service of God. But his first attempts to educate and govern other monks were deeply troubled. To say the least, on at least 2 occasions, his monastic sons tried to murder him in the old-fashioned Italian way, which was by poisoning. Benedict was discreet and prudent, however. He eventually learned how to govern monks, experimentally, even going so far as to allow a little bit of wine every day to combat sadness and to relieve the temptation of murmuring. Chapter 40 of the rule. Control over murmuring is a greater achievement than eloquence in letters. Learning by trial and error, he went on to found 13 monasteries, eventually moving to Monte Cassino, where he ascended the 1,800-foot-high mountain in 529, and on the summit, over the Temple of Apollo, laid the altar for his greatest monastery and the greatest military valor in modern history of the Polish army, I should say, eventually. A year later, he began to write the rule, written in ordinary vulgar Latin, amounting to less than 9,000 words, quite different than Augustine's work. It has neither eloquence or speculative power. Untold thousands of souls have been converted by reading Augustine. But it's hard to imagine anyone being converted merely by reading Benedict's rule. So if Augustine was the greatest stylist and speculative thinker of the Roman world in its Vespers, Benedict exemplified in those same Vespers a genius unique to the Romans. Romans always knew that their language and speculative tradition was inferior to the Greeks. They knew their religion was inferior to the Eastern religions, especially that of the Egyptians. They knew that their aesthetics were inferior to the Greeks and to the Carthaginians. But Rome's genius was, as Virgil boasted, Roman, remember, your arts are these, to pacify, to impose law, and to spare the conquered and battle down the proud. In ways unimagined and unanticipated, Benedict's rule proved to be the greatest pacification program in Western history. But the shadows had lengthened since the time of Augustine. Benedict was born 70 years after Alaric sacked Rome, less than 30 years after Attila's Huns had swept through Italy, and only 2 years after the demise of the last emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus. In this sense, he is a kind of Minervian owl. As Roman civilization collapsed around him, he didn't just understand what had happened, he established an institution that had the stamp of Roman genius. Otherwise, I don't think Benedict thought of himself or his monastic rule as either the end or the beginning of any historical epoch other than the one founded in Scripture. Above all, Luke 4. Led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days, Christ prayed, fasted, and was tempted by the devil. And so we return to the first story. Adam sinned, expelled from the Garden of Delights, thrown into a wilderness, Like the prodigal son in the plantation of sorrows, eating food not fit for swine, and not knowing the way back to the house of the Father, Christ goes into the desert to confront Adam's nemesis. And so, it's to recapitulate and reinvigorate that story that Benedict founded his school. But the key part of that sentence, that he intends to found a school, is this. He says he intends to found a school for beginners. Now, it includes rules for reading and writing, for chanting, using and cleaning farm implements, greeting strangers, determining prices for goods sent to the market. In a wily way, he said, sell under market price. In all humility, sell it under market price. Very good advice. And the school is free, no tuition by way of social class or money. We learn that the only thing required to get into the school is a willing heart and adherence to the rule. Benedict's rule governs a monastery for the rich and the poor alike because they both begin as beginners. There's no other way to go into the desert. And these beginners begin where the first light appeared, in a wilderness. There is no other curriculum for this school. If you go to Benedict's hometown of Norcia, today a little town of about 4,600 souls, in the mountains of Umbria, you can't help but very quickly find the Piazza di San Benedetto. And on the far end of the piazza stands a church and a monastery built over top of the Roman-era apartment building where Benedict was raised. In the center of the piazza is a statue of Benedict made by Giuseppe Pinci in the late 19th century. And the inscription reads, "Founder and father of monasticism in the western regions, he was driven by the Spirit to a life hidden from society, from whence there arose Renaissance of letters, the useful arts, agriculture, and sciences." It's a very astute inscription. Benedict, it suggests, is the patron saint of Europe because he went into the desert. Europe's claim to fame, in other words, is not so much that it relearned and perfected the arts and sciences preserved by the monks in the Dark Ages, but rather that Europe is a civilization founded in the desert. This is a quite radical claim that has been made more than once by Pope Benedict XVI, who has suggested that the current crisis of European identity should be understood in terms of what the Benedictines did in the wasteland. Were they merely technicians who invented tools to till the soil, or were they clearing the weeds growing around the human soul? If Benedict's rule established nothing but a trade school for learning the useful arts, clever monks making windmills and things, it would have made itself obsolete. For it's in the very nature of a trade school to graduate its students into more advanced skills. And this is how humanists in modern times interpreted Benedict's school, including that inscription of Giuseppe Pinci in the late 19th century. But if the monastic school teaches its students to awake from the mortal slumber of the old Adam, and like the prodigal, to run back to the Father, in this life anyway, no one can claim to be a graduate. You're always a beginner, and that's the genius of Western civilization. How to be a beginner. So this is what Benedict taught the Dark Ages, his and ours, and I think it's what everyone has to relearn during Lent. Second consideration, Dark Ages. Yes, the monastic centuries coincide with what is called the Dark Ages. In the West, roughly 500 years, from the 6th to the 11th century. In 1911, the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica stated the period from the 5th to the 10th centuries is called the Dark Age. By the time of the Second World War, the 14th edition had a change of heart, now insisting the contrast, once so fashionable, between the ages of darkness and the ages of life has no more truth in it than have the idealistic fancies which underlie attempts at medieval revivalism. Unquote. World War II forced that change. No self-respecting scholar today would use the term Dark Ages for those centuries, much less to periodize, categorize, or otherwise mark historical time and events, and certainly not to mark culture of any kind. But it's a mistake to drop the term Dark Ages. The collapse of Roman order in the West was devastating. That Roman order was urban and urbane. In the early 5th century, it included something like 1,000 municipalities, bound together by a civilian, demilitarized aristocracy that, for the most part, had done the trivium and spoke Latin and Greek. At its zenith, the city of Rome had more than 1 million inhabitants, a city that was served by 11 aqueducts bringing water from as far as 60 miles away over arches 100 feet tall. These cities, like Rome, and also those of a much smaller caliber, were the center of a civilization of business, politics, fine art, patronage, libraries, buildings on a large scale, also artisans, and diplomacy. And the Christian church was founded in these centers. The patriarchs and metropolitans of the Christian church led Christians from these cities: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Milan, Ravenna, and so forth. And stationed along this empire's borders was an army of roughly 500,000 men, along with a couple of 100,000 auxiliary and part-time units. All told, a generation before Benedict was born, it was the size of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps together today. And to equip and provision this enormous and very mobile force required more than 50 state factories that made swords, arrows, processed leather for various gear, made woolen products such as socks and shirts. About 1/3 of the imperial budget went to feeding, equipping, and paying the army. Another 1/3 went to maintenance of key cities, including the grain and oil handouts, and the rest to the bureaucracy. When the barbarians penetrated and then overwhelmed the imperial armies in the West, beginning in the 5th century, the tax revenue evaporated. And what emerged in the West was a libertarian heaven. What Ayn Rand taught the Dark Ages. It was a libertarian heaven. There were no taxes. And monies, therefore, for large projects would disappear for centuries. And so would cities of more than 50,000 people. By the 13th century, only a handful of cities in the West could support 50 to 100,000 people. London, Paris, Milan, maybe Genoa. 4th century levels of maritime trade across the Mediterranean would not be restored until the 19th century. Recently, drilling through the ice pack in Greenland, scientists have discovered that as those Roman factories closed, the pollution level caused by the smelting of lead, copper, and silver fell to prehistoric levels. Pollution levels were not to be regained until the 17th century. Pollution is a measure of civilization. The art of making pottery on a wheel disappeared from Britain for almost 4 centuries. Abundant coinage disappeared. Household utensils, such as cups with glossy surfaces, easy to wash, easy to stack because they had standardized shapes, became unknown to men. With the demise of cities came the demise of literacy. It's reported that the Emperor Charlemagne, around 800 AD, could read a little bit but could never quite get the hang of writing. This empire depended on an extraordinarily far-flung division of labor and knowledge. A northern Italian peasant of the 3rd or 4th century might eat off of tableware from Naples, store liquids in amphorae from North Africa, sleep under a roof consisting of tiles from the south of Gaul, and be governed by a civil administrator from Tuscany. It was a global civilization and highly diversified. It was this global economy and culture that disappeared in the West. And so peoples who lived in cities for some 2 millennia, governed by 500 years by a literate, demilitarized civil service, reaping the fruits of a global economy, became rural people under the sway of illiterate chieftains who gave land to heavily armed young men in exchange for military service. in the West of the 7th century, if you were fortunate, you might come under a little bit of Lombard law. Roman law had disappeared in any kind of as a systematic practice or as a complete set of texts in the West. Here's Edict 47 of King Rothair's law, mid-7th century, Italy. He who hits another man on the head so his bones are broken shall pay 12 solidi as compensation, if one bone is broken. He shall pay 24 solidi as compensation if 2 bones are broken, 36 for 3. If there are more broken than this, they are not to be counted. And to the question, what counts as a broken bone? The sound it makes against the shield can be heard by a distance of 12 feet away along the road, and this measure indeed shall be taken by the foot of a medium-sized man, not by hand. I mean, not even Monty Python could capture this beautifully primitive jurisprudence of various and sundry body parts, right? Although I will concede, in my state of Oklahoma, this would be viewed as liberal tort revision at this point. But Benedict's school forbids one brother from striking another, chapter 70. And it was this school that was implanted by Pope Gregory I in Kent in 576. All of Western Europe had been turned into a wilderness, and there were 2 kinds of people who felt right at home in this wilderness. Heavily armed young men who did hit one another, and monks under the rule of Benedict. In addition to the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Benedictine monks also promised stability and reform of manners. Things like, you can't run away and you can't hit each other. The absolute opposite of a raiding party. Stability was perhaps the most important vow for the Dark Age. For when Benedictines established a community, they were there to stay. Unlike the warrior class, which was mobile and just short of nomadic, the monks would arrive, clear the forests, irrigate and cultivate the land, and within earshot of their bells, lay people could begin once again to measure time, to have families, because there could be some stability of agriculture. And it was from the monks they learned how to properly bury the dead, and how to read and write, and how to do things which transcend a life of mere subsistence. And this is what Benedict taught the Dark Ages. How to live life as a whole, not so much a worldly life of success, but one of human success. Not only how to divide a day, which is pretty important, but how to divide it unto wisdom. And I think it's important to draw the right moral lesson from this story. The Dark Ages were dark not merely because the lights of technology were extinguished, but because no one knew or remembered how to reproduce the whole of a civilization. The light that was lost was not the tool, but knowledge and wisdom. Let's say the habits of knowledge and action, which technology presupposes, at least for the proper use of tools. And so I'll propose, we too are capable of losing this light even in the midst of tools. Consider all of the things you might not know how to do. Prepare a corpse for burial. Decide whether grandma is dead. Recite from memory even a single chapter of Jewish or Christian scriptures, or even the preamble to your state constitution. Judge what is an authentic or an inauthentic copy of a book. Recall your paternal or maternal ancestors by name 5 generations back. Distinguish between what is an established fact and what is mere opinion. Distinguish between law and force. Distinguish what is pleasant to the senses and what is good. Distinguish what is good from what is morally good. Distinguish between transitory relationships keyed to survival and enduring memberships. And here's the key point. To be able to do that not in the lonely privacy of one's own opinion, but in the light of common institutions. The lonely privacy of one's opinion cannot bear the weight of the world, much less a civilized one. And that is a dark age. So, of the things I just listed, seems to me all of them are compatible with the condition of a people who have and know how to use very sophisticated tools. If one has forgotten how to live a good life rather than a life of mere subsistence, a life in which every day is a disorganized disaster, an array of tools, in fact, would constitute a prison, similar to or even worse than a life of mere subsistence. Curriculum. Benedict taught an integrated knowledge along three fronts. And so I say he taught materially, politically, and poetically. But as Cardinal Newman said, it's the poetic that suffuses the Benedictine curriculum. First, as to the materials of life, nothing is more important than light and dark, namely, an answer to the question, what suffices for a day? Infants and very young children are ignorant of what constitutes a day. And I am told that even very knowledgeable college students today have problems in this regard, that a collegiate day is a 24/7 flow of flickering images resembling a casino in Nevada, plenty of light but no illumination. Like the practical wisdom displayed in Genesis, Benedict begins with a day equally measured, 8 hours of prayer, 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of rest, adjusted for the seasons. And a day having been properly established, the rule prescribes a unity of things which the ancient world typically kept apart. In the ancient world, Mediterranean world, personal dignity was measured by its remotion or distance from tools and labor. And in fact, the warrior class of the Dark Ages did not work the land. They killed with their hands, they did not work with them. But Benedict's motto was prayer and work. Monks had to be contemplatives and laborers and hold those two together. And in this school, it's essential to join together not only prayer and work, but prayer and reading. Consider all of the acts associated with reading. By the way, he specifically prescribes in the rule that when Lent begins, all monks are to be given a book. And if they finish reading them, to come back and get another one. So Lent is a time of reading. But reading summons all these different acts: speaking, meditating, cogitating, imagining, remembering, understanding, desiring. By summoning so many mental actions and even physical postures, reading can be profoundly integrative. It forms a clearing in the forest of sensations of the soul and creates a place for prayer and study. And regarding the social organization of persons in a monastery, three very important points. It's characterized by easy entrance and difficult exit. The monastery is a voluntary society and is not particularly picky about who joins. Within a month or so, the applicant is inside the walls. A few years later, he is professed and solemnly professed a couple of years after that. But the learning curve is long, the rest of one's life. You can never claim not to be a beginner. Each abbey is quasi-autonomous and self-sufficient under the rule and direction of their own abbot. The key to self-sufficiency is the vow of stability. Third, the Benedictine rule emphasizes equality among the brothers. For most public purposes, monks are distinguished only by their date of entrance, that is, according to the principle of seniority. Even the youngest monks can vote in an abbatial election. All of these add up to a very sturdy social structure in the wilderness. Literate men and women, under a common rule, knowing how to divide a day and how to live a stable life in a certain place, not only within a day, but over years, competent to contemplate and to work with their hands, having as their only standard of admission that the novice have a willing heart, and all of themselves counting themselves as beginners from the day they enter until they die. From inside this perspective, it doesn't really matter too much whether the whole thing is destroyed. The Vikings come and destroy it. So long as it starts again, and it can easily start again. It was never meant to be anything but a school for beginners, completely unlike the University of Chicago. Okay. You destroy it and you're not going to get it back. But the Benedictine school is for beginners. You can get it back. Third and most important, it teaches, this school, through the senses and the imagination. In one of his greatest essays, The Mission of St. Benedict, which was published in Atlantis magazine, January 1858, John Henry Newman reckoned that the three great paradigms of teaching in Latin Christianity were Benedict, who taught poetically, Dominic, who taught scientifically, and Ignatius of Loyola, who taught practically. But by poetry, Newman did not necessarily mean the craft of poetry, which is the craft of constructing metered verse. Rather, he meant a way of learning that arises from sense, experience, and imagination. And its special feature is wonder. The Latin-speaking world calls it admiratio, admiration, taking from this adjective mirus, wonderful. We could call it knowledge that's touched by the thing being known. Here then is Newman, addressing what he thinks was the genius of the Benedictine method of teaching and learning, by which he means teaching and learning in the monastery. Quote, reason investigates, analyzes, numbers, weighs, measures, ascertains, locates all of the objects fit for its contemplation, and thus gains a scientific knowledge of them. Science results in a system with a complex unity. Poetry, however, delights in the indefinite and various as contrasted with unity, and in the simple as contrasted with system. The aim of science is to get a hold of things, to grasp them, to handle them, to comprehend them. That is, to master them or to be superior to them. But as to the poetical, very different is the frame of mind necessary for its perception. It demands as its primary condition that we should not put ourselves above the objects in which it resides, but at their feet, so that we should feel them to be above us and beyond us, and that we should look up to them. And that instead of fancying that we can comprehend them, we should take it for granted that we are surrounded and comprehended by them ourselves. So, as Newman sees it, the scientific method requires one to stand above the things being studied. That is, the dignity of the mind replaces the dignity of the object. Poetic learning, however, is for the youth, scientific for the mature. Wisdom is more like poetry than proof. In Latin, the word sapiens, of course, denotes a person who can savor or taste. Wisdom is knowing something that one can savor. And so in chapter 19 of the rule, Benedict prescribes that psalms are to be chanted sapienter, wisely. That is, he did not have a scientific theology of the psalms. He had a rule for savoring them. And this was a rule written for youth in a world grown old, which is the Dark Ages, a world grown old. Not the world as it ought to be, but alas cannot be, but Benedict's for a world as seen by a youth that's admired just the way it appears and as it's known first through contact suffused by emotion. Above all, this school's curriculum teaches one the slowness of the good. And I think we all can remember what it was like to learn that way when we were younger, when a summer seemed like a lifetime, when almost effortlessly a youth could learn more in 3 months than an adult in 3 years, precisely because of its slowness. So the life envisaged by Benedict is not a 5-year plan or a senior thesis or a job report. The monk's life is rolled out like verses of a psalm, little parts cumulatively becoming something more. And this is what Benedict taught the Dark Ages. I think his and ours, the slowness of the good. And this is where we take the word Lent from. In the Middle Ages, Lent was taken from the Germanic word for long. In Benedict's school, however, the Latin verb, adverb, lente, slowly, is the better term. So, finally, hearkening. I want to take you to the beginning of the rule where presumably everyone who will begin. The first words, "Hearken, my son, with the ear of your heart, and hear the precepts of your master." This poetical approach identified by Lumen jumps right off of the page. Hearken, not read, study, or merely listen. To hearken is to attend to something that's immediate. The notion of knowledge touched by the thing being known is highlighted. And he uses the term, the ear of one's heart. One is bidden to incline, to turn towards something as from an inner principle. And Benedict continues, readily, freely, accept and faithfully follow the advice of your pious father, so that through the labor of obedience you may return to him from whom you have withdrawn because of laziness of disobedience. My words are meant for you, whoever you are, quis, who, laying aside your own will take up the all-powerful and righteous arms of obedience. Here, Benedict embeds the story of the prodigal son. Let's say the filius or filia, son or daughter, who turns to the voice of the father. And he puts the words from Luke, "Therefore let us arise." And arising, he went to the father. In the story of the prodigal. Then, in this prologue, the text shifts from the verb hearken to its linguistic sister, obdire, to listen toward a word, obedience. Benedict's student would have been familiar, at least in the 6th century, not only with the story of the prodigal son, but also the traditional ideal of a Roman father, the pater familias, who is by right a domestic magistrate, invested with public charge inside his household, including capital powers of life and death over his wife, son, slaves, and domestic animals. In the Roman world, what does the son owe to the father to the city to the protecting gods? Pietas. It's the kind of reverence of an inferior to a superior. More precisely, pietas is the proper response on the part of someone who can never pay back what is received. But it's abundantly clear that in the prologue, when he says, "Your most pious father," Benedict is not referring to that kind of daddy. In fact, amazingly, the word pater familias is used but once in the rule in chapter 2, and it pertains to Christ as Good Shepherd. Here's what's important. Benedict is referring to a father who is himself pious. That is, tender, pater piissime. A tender and merciful father who has the virtue of piety to what is lower than himself, to human beings created in his own image. And this takes us back to the prodigal, the father who from afar sees the son trying to return and who takes the initiative. This is not the stern Roman father. The monastery, Benedict says, is the school for the Our Father, the Pater Noster. Again, a school for beginners. That's just how you begin. So let me take you to one more paragraph in the prologue to the rule. We read, "Let us arise at last, since the scripture arouses us, saying, it's now time for us to rise from sleep." Interestingly, Benedict now embeds Lazarus from John 11, Lazarus come out, into the story of the prodigal come back, and the Easter story of the Passion and Resurrection, arise. And the paragraph continues. "Let us open our eyes to a deifying light, and let us attune our ears to what the divine voice admonishes, daily crying out, if today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts." So, Benedict teaches through these verbs that recur over and over again in the rule. Hearken, hasten, awaken, arise, turn, obey, leave aside, listen, incline. The whole prologue bristles in this mood, but in a way that's strangely soothing. He requires that when the bells summon to prayer 8 times a day, the monk must drop everything and turn toward the sound. Incline, awake, arise, hearken, and then go to prayer. It's a splendidly simple reenactment or recapitulation of the gospel. Come back, come out, arise. 8 times a day, 56 times a week. Simply put everything aside and turn toward the voice. And so now I can conclude by suggesting what Benedict taught the Dark Ages. In one of the stanzas of his poem, Ash Wednesday, T.S. Eliot writes, "I renounce the blessed face and renounce the voice because I cannot hope to turn again. Consequently, I rejoice having to construct something upon which to rejoice." Eliot's meditation reminds us of Hegel's Owl of Minerva, who can only understand when it's too late to be hopeful. The Owl of Minerva knows how it ends. The Owl of Minerva does not know how to begin. The simplest, most natural, and supernaturally the most urgent thing proves to be the most difficult: to begin, or to turn once again. And this is what Benedict taught: how to begin, to be an incipient, a beginner. And this is the fine line, a hair's breadth, between being a prodigal and a pilgrim. Thank you.